She ran from the silence of her own home, a quiet so loud it had become a scream. The memory of her brother, Liam, was in every empty room, in the dust motes dancing in sunlight where he used to sit. His hands, once so expressive, were now still beneath the earth, and the world had lost its voice. Elara sought the opposite of that silence. She sought a place so rigid, so steeped in ancient and unbreakable tradition, that there would be no room for her grief to breathe. The Citadel of Nocturne was such a place. Carved from the heart of a mountain, it was a fortress of black basalt and obsidian, a place that drank the moonlight and gave nothing back. It was the heart of the vampire kingdom, a realm that had existed for millennia, hidden from the fleeting world of mortals. Humans were not welcome here. They were food or they were nothing, except for the servants. The servants were a necessity, a caste of mortals who purchased their lives and the safety of their families with absolute, unquestioning servitude. They were ghosts in the machine, polishing silver that would never tarnish and sweeping dust that never seemed to fall. They moved through the great, cold halls with their eyes downcast, their presence tolerated but never acknowledged. Elara had begged for the position. She had sold the last of her family's possessions for the right to be interviewed, to stand before a severe, unblinking majordomo whose eyes held the weary weight of centuries. She had offered nothing but a lifetime of silent, efficient work. Perhaps the desperation in her eyes, a reflection of his own eternal ennui, was what convinced him. She was hired, a scullery maid, the lowest of the low. Her new life would be one of stone floors, lye soap, and a silence far older and deeper than the one she had fled. It was, she thought, a perfect place to disappear. Her first formal duty was to attend the evening assembly in the great hall. It was not a banquet, not a celebration. It was a ritual. The court gathered, silent and still as the gargoyles that watched from the vaulted ceiling. They stood in their designated places, a living tableau of power and age, their fine silks and velvets absorbing the cold light from the crystalline chandeliers. At the far end of the hall, on a throne of polished obsidian that seemed carved from solidified night, sat the king. King Theron. He was ancient, his stillness absolute. He did not move, did not breathe in any way a mortal could perceive. His face was a mask of pale, aristocratic beauty, framed by hair as black as a raven's wing. But his eyes were the color of a winter storm, deep and cold and filled with a power that pressed down on the very air in the room. They saw everything and revealed nothing. Elara stood with the other servants, pressed against the cold stone wall, trying to make herself smaller, to fade into the mortar between the stones. This was a world of predators, and she was a mouse hiding in a den of sleeping lions. The silence here was different from the one at home. It was not empty. It was heavy, charged with unspoken rivalries, ancient grudges, and the coiled potential for violence. Beside the great throne, on a smaller, unadorned chair, sat a child. He was the Prince Kaelen. Elara had heard the whispers in the kitchens, fragmented and fearful. The air was flawed, a broken thing. He was small for his age, with his father's black hair but none of his terrifying presence. He was a shadow at the edge of the court's awareness, an uncomfortable secret they were all forced to witness every night. He never spoke. He never made a sound. He sat clutching a small, intricately carved silver bird, his knuckles white. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the floor. He was the center of a vortex of disapproval, a palpable thing that emanated from the stiff-backed nobles. The assembly proceeded in its silent, unnerving ritual. A transfer of documents, a nod of the king's head, a dismissal. It was a government run on glances and gestures so subtle Elara could not comprehend them. Then it happened. A tiny, metallic clatter that echoed in the cavernous hall like a thunderclap. The prince's silver bird had slipped from his grasp. It lay on the polished floor between him and the throne, gleaming under the cold light. The entire hall went rigid. Not a head turned, not an eye flickered. The nobles stood like statues, their disdain a physical force. The king remained motionless, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of his kingdom. The child, Prince Kaelen, did not move to retrieve his toy. A single tear traced a path down his pale cheek, but he made no sound. He just stared at the fallen bird, his small body trembling. No one moved. To acknowledge the prince's clumsiness was to acknowledge his weakness, his imperfection. And in the court of Nocturne, imperfection was a disease. Elara's heart constricted. She saw not a vampire prince, but a lonely little boy. She saw Liam, on his first day of school, dropping his books and standing frozen as the other children stared. Their silence a wall he could not breach. The memory was a physical blow. Her training, her fear, the desperate need to remain invisible. It all evaporated. Before she understood what she was doing, her hands moved. It was a small, furtive gesture, half hidden in the shadows where she stood. A movement of her fingers, a turn of her wrist. A question formed in the language of silence she had shared with her brother. "Are you all right?" The prince's head snapped up. His dark eyes, so long fixed on the floor, locked with hers across the vast expanse of stone. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, his eyes widened, not in fear, but in pure, unadulterated shock. A flicker of understanding, of recognition. It was a connection so profound, so impossible, that it changed the very quality of the air. And everyone felt it. The change was subtle at first, a collective intake of breath that wasn't there. Then, slowly, as if breaking a spell, heads turned. Not towards the prince, but towards her. Dozens of pairs of ancient, predatory eyes, all fixing on the insignificant human servant in the corner. A low murmur, like the growl of a disturbed beast, rippled through the court. Elara froze, her hand still half raised. The warmth of her impulsive act was instantly chilled by a terror so profound it stole the air from her lungs. What had she done? She had broken the first and most important rule. She had made herself seen. A figure detached itself from the king's right side. Lord Valerius, the Chancellor. He was tall and elegant, his silver hair a stark contrast to the king's black. His smile was a thin, sharp curve, a razor's edge. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the hall like a blade through silk. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone a perfect blend of deference and command. "A breach. The human has forgotten its place." He did not look at Elara. He addressed the king, but his condemnation was aimed at her like a physical spear. The word human was an epithet, an insect, a piece of filth that had crawled into view. "It has attempted to communicate with the prince," Valerius continued, the word communicate laced with disgust. "A contamination. It must be removed." Removed. The word hung in the air, cold and final. Elara knew it did not mean dismissal. It meant destruction. Her life, purchased at such a high cost, was about to be extinguished over a single, compassionate gesture. The court waited. Their gazes shifted from Elara to the king, hungry for the inevitable verdict. They were a pack, and the scent of blood, even the thin, worthless blood of a human, was tantalizing. King Theron had not moved. His storm-gray eyes, however, had shifted. They were not on the Chancellor, nor on the trembling servant. They were fixed on his son. He watched as Kaelen, for the first time all evening, lowered his gaze from Elara and looked at the fallen silver bird. Then, with a hesitant, jerky motion, the boy's small hands began to move. His fingers were clumsy, uncertain. He was mimicking the shape Elara had made. A question. It was a broken, misshapen echo of a word, but it was a word nonetheless. A profound stillness fell over King Theron. For the first time in a century, an emotion flickered in the depths of his winter eyes. It was not anger. It was not annoyance. It was something far more complex, something that looked almost like shock. He raised a single, long-fingered hand. The gesture was minimal, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The murmuring in the hall ceased instantly. Lord Valerius bowed his head, awaiting the order. The human. The king's voice was a low rumble, the sound of stone grinding against stone after ages of silence. "What is its name?" The majordomo stepped forward, his face pale. "Elara, your majesty." "Elara." Theron repeated the name, tasting it. His gaze finally moved, sweeping across the hall to land on her. It was like being pinned by the weight of a collapsing mountain. Fear made her want to bolt, to scream, to dissolve into nothing. But she held his gaze, her body trembling uncontrollably. "She will not be removed," the king declared. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, echoed through the court. It was unthinkable, unprecedented. Lord Valerius's mask of serene authority cracked. A flicker of disbelief, then fury, crossed his features before being ruthlessly suppressed. "Majesty, the protocols are clear. Unsolicited interaction with the royal line, especially from a—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely in Elara's direction. "I am aware of the protocols, Valerius." The king's voice dropped, taking on a dangerous edge that promised swift and terrible consequences for any who defied him. "I wrote them." He rose from his throne. The movement was fluid, silent, and utterly commanding. He was a creature of immense power, and the simple act of standing sent a wave of reflexive fear through his court. He descended the dais, his black cloak whispering over the stone. He did not stop until he stood before his son. He looked down at Kaelen, at the boy's small, trembling hands still trying to form the sign. Then he looked at Elara. "From this moment," he announced, his voice resonating in the bones of every creature in the hall, "her duties are changed. She is no longer a scullery maid." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "She will attend the prince." The shock in the room was a physical thing, a silent explosion of outrage and disbelief. To elevate a human, a new, unknown servant, to the most sensitive position in the Citadel? To place her at the side of the heir? It was madness. "She stays," Theron said, his final word a command that was as immutable as the mountain itself. He turned and swept back to his throne, the matter concluded. The pursuing antagonist, in this case, the court's rigid and suffocating tradition, had been confronted. The king had rebuffed it publicly and established his claim not over Elara as a possession, but over her function. She was his now, an instrument for a purpose only he seemed to understand. As the assembly was dismissed in a flurry of silent, venomous glares, a figure approached Elara. It was Seraphina, captain of the royal guard. Her armor was the color of dried blood, her face a roadmap of old scars. Her eyes, unlike the others, held not contempt, but a sharp, assessing curiosity. "Come with me," she said, her voice rough. "Your new life has begun." Elara was led away from the kitchens and the shared, miserable bunks of the lower servants. She was taken up winding staircases, through corridors lined with portraits of pale, stern-faced vampires whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. The air grew colder, thinner. This was the royal wing, a place no human servant was ever permitted to enter unless summoned. Her new quarters were adjacent to the prince's. It was a small, Spartan room, but it was private. It had a bed with clean linens and a small, barred window that looked out onto a sheer drop of black rock. It was a cage, but a gilded one. Seraphina left her with a final, terse warning. "The king has given you a task. Do not fail him. Many here would see you do just that." The immediate threat of execution was gone, but a new, more insidious uncertainty remained. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. She was no longer invisible. She was a focal point, a disruption, a human girl who had, with a single gesture, thrown a stone into a deep, stagnant pond. And now she had to face the ripples. Later that night, the king stood alone in his private study. The room was a library of ancient sorrows, filled with scrolls and tomes that chronicled the long, bloody history of his people. A single candle burned on his desk, its flame barely disturbing the oppressive darkness. He was not thinking of politics, of Valerius's barely concealed ambition, or the court's outrage. He was thinking of a woman named Lyra, his wife, his queen. She had been vibrant, a supernova in his cold, eternal night. She had laughed in the silent halls, her voice a melody that had chipped away at the ice around his heart. She had wanted a child, a symbol of their love, an heir that was more than just a continuation of a bloodline. The birth had been difficult, a traumatic event that had stolen her light. Kaelen had been born small, fragile, and silent. He did not cry. He did not make a sound. The court physicians, ancient and wise, had no explanation. He was physically perfect, yet utterly mute. Lyra had seen it as a curse. She had seen the court's judgment in their averted eyes, heard their whispers about a flawed succession. The pressure, the grief had consumed her. She had faded, a flower deprived of sun, until one day she simply was not. She had walked out into the dawn, embracing the sunlight that was poison to their kind, and had become nothing but a memory and a pile of ash. Theron had sealed that part of himself away. He had buried his heart with her ashes and had become the king his court required, cold, pragmatic, and unyielding. He performed his duties, maintained the peace, and ruled with an iron fist because it was all he had left. He had seen his son's silence as a reflection of his own failure, a constant, painful reminder of his greatest loss. He had kept Kaelen by his side out of a sense of duty, a duty that had long ago lost any trace of warmth. Until tonight, when that human girl, Elara, had made the sign, something had shifted in the universe. He had seen the flash of understanding in his son's eyes. It was the first time Kaelen had truly connected with another living being. It was not contamination. It was a key to a lock Theron had long since believed was rusted shut. He did not know this human. He did not trust her. But she possessed a skill, a language, that had reached his son where no one and nothing else could. For that, he would protect her. He would break every protocol, defy every tradition, and face down his entire court. For the first time in a very long time, a flicker of something long buried, a fierce paternal protectiveness, had stirred within him. He was not just a king. He was a father. And he would see what this strange, brave little human could do for his silent son. The days that followed were a strange mixture of profound loneliness and intense purpose. Elara's life was now entirely circumscribed by the prince's chambers. They were vast and opulent, filled with toys that were never played with and books that were never read. A thick layer of dust coated everything, a testament to the neglect the prince had endured. Kaelen was a ghost in his own rooms. He would sit for hours in a window seat, staring out at the perpetual twilight of the Citadel's deep chasm, his silver bird clutched in his hand. He was wary of her, his initial shock having receded into a deep, ingrained mistrust. Elara did not push. She remembered how Liam had been after the fever stole his hearing. Withdrawn, angry, and lost in a world that no longer made sense. She understood that trust was not a door to be kicked open, but a seed to be planted. So she began her work. She cleaned. She polished the dusty toys, arranged the unread books. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never intruding on his space. But as she worked, she signed. She would hold up a book. She would point to the moon visible through the window. Moon. She would touch the velvet cushion on a chair. Soft, simple, single words. She offered them to the silence without expectation, like leaving seeds for a timid bird. For days, Kaelen gave no reaction. He watched her, his dark eyes following her every move, but he did not respond. The first breakthrough came a week later. Elara was polishing his silver bird, the one he had dropped in the great hall. She held it up, its surface gleaming. Bird, she signed. Then, on an impulse, she added another sign, one Liam had loved. Fly. Her hands mimicked the beating of wings. Kaelen, who had been watching from his window seat, slid to the floor. He crept forward, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. He stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes fixed on her hands. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his own. He copied the sign for bird. Then, his brow furrowed in concentration, he tried to copy the sign for fly. His movements were clumsy, but the intent was clear. Elara's breath caught in her throat. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. She nodded, her encouragement a silent beacon. Yes, she signed. Bird. Fly. He did it again, more confidently this time. And for the first time since she had arrived, Elara saw the faintest glimmer of a smile on the prince's face. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. It was the first crack in the wall of silence that had imprisoned him for his entire life. Their lessons became a secret ritual, a silent world they built together in the dusty, forgotten chambers. The vocabulary grew. Hungry. Sud. Happy. Story. Father. Kaelen was a ferociously intelligent child, a sponge soaking up the language he had been denied. His hands, once perpetually clenched around his toy, became graceful and expressive. He began to tell her things, not just what he wanted but what he thought. He told her of the recurring nightmare he had, of falling through endless darkness. He told her he liked the color of her hair, the brown of good earth, so different from the blacks and silvers of the court. He asked her about the sun, a thing he had only ever seen in paintings. Elara, in turn, told him about Liam. She told him how they had invented their own signs for things, a secret language just for them. She spoke of her brother's laughter, a silent, shaking of his whole body that she missed more than breathing. In teaching the prince, she found a way to keep her brother's memory alive, to give his silence a new purpose. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. The court was not blind. Whispers followed Elara whenever she was forced to leave the prince's chambers to fetch meals. The nobles, led by Lord Valerius, saw her not as a tutor, but as a poison, a human influence that was corrupting the royal bloodline, emphasizing the prince's weakness instead of concealing it. The chancellor decided it was time to act. He cornered her in a secluded corridor, his presence so sudden and silent she almost cried out. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly predatory. "The girl," he said, his voice a pleasant, chilling murmur. He did not use her name. "Your experiment with the prince has been noted. A charming, if misguided, effort." Elara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He is learning, my lord. He has a voice." Valerius's smile was sharp as broken glass. "He has a deformity, one you are encouraging. You are teaching him a language of peasants and cripples. You are cementing his status as an unfit heir." He took a step closer, his cold aura washing over her. "The king is sentimental. He is blinded by a grief that is centuries old. But the stability of this kingdom cannot rest on a father's foolish hopes." He produced a small, heavy pouch from within his cloak. The clink of coin was loud in the quiet hallway. "I am offering you a merciful way out. This is enough gold to ensure you live the rest of your short human life in comfort. Far away from here, you will be given safe passage to the human lands. You will leave tonight and never return." It was not an offer. It was a command wrapped in the guise of a choice. "And if I refuse?" Elara's voice was barely a whisper. The chancellor's smile vanished. His eyes became flat, cold stones. "Then you will discover that the king's protection is not absolute. Accidents happen. Servants disappear. The Citadel is a very large, very old place. Many things get lost within its walls." The threat was unmistakable. He was giving her a chance to flee. If she stayed, she would be eliminated. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She could run. She could take the gold and disappear, find a new life, a new place to hide from her grief. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then she saw Kaelen's face in her mind. She saw his hands forming the sign for story. She saw the trust in his eyes, the burgeoning hope. Leaving him now would be abandoning him to the crushing silence, to the cold disdain of the court. It would be a betrayal far worse than any punishment Valerius could devise. It would be like leaving Liam all over again. A new strength, born of desperation and a fierce, protective love, rose in her. She met the chancellor's gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not leave him." Valerius stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow, cold anger began to build in his eyes. "A foolish, sentimental choice. You have just signed your own death warrant." He turned and swept away, his black cloak swirling around him like a shroud. Elara leaned against the cold stone wall, her legs trembling. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the court, aside from the king himself. She had made a definitive choice. She was no longer a victim fleeing her past. She was a guardian standing her ground. Her allegiance was not to the servant's code of invisibility, but to the silent boy who depended on her. The Chancellor's countermove was swift and cunning. If he could not remove the human directly, he would escalate the political pressure on the king. He sent missives to the outlying baronies, subtle messages that spoke of instability at the heart of the kingdom, of a weak heir and a distracted monarch. His greatest success was the invitation he extended to Baron Volkov of the Ashen Marches. Volkov was a rival, a powerful and ambitious vampire lord whose domain bordered Theron's. He was everything Theron was not: loud, ostentatious, and openly brutal. He arrived at the Citadel with a large retinue of fierce, disciplined soldiers, ostensibly for a diplomatic visit. In reality, he was a vulture, circling what he perceived to be a dying throne. He made no secret of his contempt for the situation. At the next evening assembly, he stood beside Valerius, his eyes, the color of old blood, fixed on Prince Kaelen. "A silent heir, Theron," Volkov said, his voice a booming affront to the hall's traditional quiet. "A dangerous precedent. A kingdom needs a strong voice at its head. A bloodline that commands respect, not pity." Theron's face was unreadable, but Elara could see the tightening of the muscles in his jaw. "My son's strength is not for you to measure, Volkov." "Perhaps not," Volkov conceded with a predatory grin. "But a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And when a king's attention is diverted by human novelties—" He let his gaze slide over to Elara, lingering with a possessive, dismissive heat that made her skin crawl. The alliance between Valerius and Volkov was now plain for all to see. They were framing the king's protection of Elara and his son as a weakness, a crack in the foundation of his rule. The court, ever sensitive to the currents of power, began to shift. Nobles who had been neutral now offered quiet words of support to the Chancellor. The pressure on Theron was immense. Serafina found Elara late one night. The guard captain's face was grim. "The court is turning, girl. Valerius and Volkov are poisoning the well. They are planning something. What can we do?" Elara asked, her hands twisting the fabric of her simple dress. "We watch," Serafina said, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "The king is not a fool. He knows what they are doing, but he is bound by ancient laws of hospitality. He cannot strike first against a guest, even one as venomous as Volkov. We must wait for them to show their hand." The wait was not long. The Blood Moon Gala was an ancient tradition, a night of ritual and feasting that occurred once a decade. It was a time when the court celebrated its own permanence, its eternal nature. It was also a time of heightened security and carefully observed protocol. It was the perfect night for a coup. The great hall was transformed. Blood-red banners hung from the rafters. The tables were laden with crystal goblets filled with the richest vintage, a crimson liquid that was the lifeblood of their race. The court was dressed in its finest, a sea of black, silver, and deep crimson. Elara stood near the throne with Kaelen. The prince was dressed in a formal black tunic, looking smaller and more fragile than ever amidst the powerful, ancient beings. He was nervous, his hands fluttering at his sides. Elara stayed close, offering him silent words of reassurance. Theron sat on his throne, a figure of immense, coiled stillness. He watched the proceedings, his gaze sweeping the room, missing nothing. He knew, as Serafina knew, that this night was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came during the rite of allegiance. One by one, The heads of the noble houses were to approach the throne and reaffirm their loyalty. It was a ceremony of power, meant to unify the kingdom. Valerius and Volkov chose that moment to strike. As the first noble knelt, Volkov's soldiers, who had been mingling with the court, suddenly drew hidden blades. Simultaneously, a faction of the royal guard, loyal to Valerius, turned on their comrades. The hall erupted into chaos. The loyalists, led by Seraphina, were caught by surprise but reacted instantly, forming a defensive circle around the throne. The clash of steel rang through the hall, a sound unheard in the Citadel for centuries. Volkov, a massive war hammer appearing in his hands as if from nowhere, charged directly towards the dais. The throne is forfeit, Theron. The age of weakness is over. Valerius did not join the fight. His goal was more specific. He moved with chilling speed towards the side of the throne. His target not the king, but the prince. Seize the heir and you control the succession. Everything happened at once. Theron rose to meet Volkov's charge. Seraphina's loyalists were locked in a desperate battle. Elara instinctively pulled Kaelen behind her, shielding his small body with her own. But Kaelen was not looking at the fighting on the floor. His eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on the high, shadowed balconies that overlooked the hall. He had seen something no one else had. A glint of metal, a cloaked figure, one of Valerius's men, an archer, taking aim not at the king, but at Elara. The strategy was diabolical. Kill the human, the source of the king's distraction. In the ensuing chaos, Theron would be enraged, unfocused, vulnerable. Kaelen couldn't scream. He couldn't shout a warning. The assassin was drawing the bowstring taut. He grabbed Elara's arm, his small fingers digging into her flesh. She looked down, saw the panic in his eyes. He signed frantically, his hands a blur of motion.
Danger.
Hi, man kill. Elara's head snapped up. She followed his terrified gaze to the balcony. She saw the archer, the nocked arrow aimed directly at her heart. There was no time to think, no time for fear. She did the one thing she had been trained her entire life never to do in this place. She used her voice. Above! She screamed, the sound raw and piercing. A human cry in a hall of silent predators. The balcony! An assassin! Her scream cut through the din of battle. It was so unexpected, so alien, that for a fraction of a second, everyone froze. That fraction of a second was all the king needed. Theron, who had been locked in a brutal standoff with Volkov, moved. He did not move like a man or even a vampire. He became a blur of shadow, an absence of light that flowed across the dais with impossible speed. The arrow was loosed, a black streak flying towards Elara. But before it could find its mark, Theron was there. He did not catch the arrow. He did not deflect it. He simply appeared in its path, letting it shatter against his chest as if it were a dry twig. The fabric of his tunic was torn, but his flesh was unmarked. He turned his head, and his winter-storm eyes, now blazing with a cold, terrifying light, fixed on the assassin in the rafters. He raised a hand, and a tendril of pure shadow lashed out from the floor, wrapping around the archer and crushing him in a silent, brutal instant. The king was unleashed. He was no longer a stoic monarch. He was the ancient, primal creature he had suppressed for centuries. He moved through the battle not as a combatant, but as a force of nature. He did not kill wantonly. His movements were precise, economical, and devastating. He disabled, he did not slaughter. A touch to a traitor's arm left it shattered. A glance sent another flying into a stone pillar, where they crumpled, unconscious. He was a whirlwind of controlled, terrifying power, proving that his restraint was a choice, not a weakness. He was not the monster his enemies believed him to be, but he was more than capable of reminding them why he had ruled for 2,000 years. Baron Volkov, his face a mask of shock and rage, swung his massive hammer at the king. Theron sidestepped the blow with contemptuous ease, the hammerhead shattering the obsidian throne behind him. Before Volkov could recover, Theron's hand shot out, gripping the Baron's throat. "My house is not for you to break, Volkov." Theron's voice was a low, deadly whisper. There was a sharp crack, and the Baron crumpled to the floor, defeated. His hubris had been his downfall. The fighting stopped. The remaining traitors dropped their weapons, their faces filled with a primal terror. Only Valerius remained. He stood frozen, his plan in ruins, his hand outstretched towards Kaelen. He looked at the carnage, at his defeated ally, and at the king, who now turned his blazing eyes upon him. "This was for the kingdom," Valerius stammered, his composure finally breaking. "To save us from a weak succession. To preserve our strength." "You know nothing of strength," Theron said, his voice echoing with the weight of ages. He strode towards the chancellor, each step a judgment. Seraphina and 2 loyal guards seized Valerius, who did not resist. His ambition had turned to ash. The king did not stop until he stood before Elara and his son. The battle was over. The hall was a ruin of shattered goblets and fallen bodies. He looked at Elara, who was still shielding Kaelen, her body trembling but her resolve unbroken. His gaze softened, the terrifying fire in his eyes receding. He knelt. The king of Nocturne, the ancient and terrible monarch, knelt on the cold stone floor so that he was eye level with his son. Kaelen, seeing the battle was over, stepped out from behind Elara. He looked at his father, his eyes wide. Theron slowly, deliberately, raised his hands. He signed, the movements careful, like a man speaking a language he was only just learning. "You saved." Kaelen stared at his father's hands, and then up at his face. A slow, wondrous smile bloomed on the boy's face. He launched himself forward, wrapping his small arms around his father's neck. Theron hesitated for a moment, then his arms came up, holding his son in a fierce, protective embrace. He closed his eyes, holding the child he had almost lost, the child whose silent voice had just saved them all. Over Kaelen's shoulder, he looked at Elara. His expression was one of profound, unspoken gratitude. He had been a king, a ruler, a general. But in his grief, he had forgotten how to be a father. This small, mortal woman had reminded him. She had not just given his son a voice. She had given him back his son. The aftermath of the failed coup was swift and absolute. Baron Volkov and the surviving traitors were imprisoned, their fates to be decided by ancient law. The great hall was cleaned, the signs of battle erased, but the memory of it lingered, a stark reminder of the kingdom's brush with destruction. A day later, King Theron convened his court. The nobles who remained were subdued, their faces a mixture of fear and newfound respect. They had witnessed their king's terrible power, but they had also witnessed the reason for it, a father's love. Theron stood before the shattered throne, refusing to sit. Kaelen stood beside him, and for the first time, he did not clutch his silver bird. His hands were relaxed, ready. Elara stood a few paces behind them, a silent observer in the heart of power. For decades, the king began, his voice clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "This court has looked upon my son and seen only silence. You saw weakness, an imperfection, a problem for the succession." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles, pinning each in turn. "You were wrong." His silence was not a weakness. It was a prison built by our own prejudice and fear. A prison I, myself, helped to maintain. The admission was stunning, a confession of fallibility that no one had ever heard him utter. But he was never weak. His eyes were open. He saw what none of you saw. His mind was sharp. And when the moment came, he found a voice to warn us. He placed a hand on Kaelen's shoulder. "This is Kaelen, my son. He is the undisputed heir to the throne of Nocturne. His voice is the silent tongue. And you will all learn to listen." He then issued his decree, a permanent, game-changing law that would forever alter the fabric of their society. From this day forward, the language of signs is to be considered an official language of this court. It will be taught to every member of the royal guard, to every noble house, to every official who serves the throne. It will be the language of loyalty, of vigilance. To be blind to it will be to declare yourself deaf to the commands of your future king. A murmur of shock went through the court, but it was quickly silenced. They understood. This was the new order. The prince's perceived flaw had been forged into a requisite strength for the entire kingdom. Furthermore, Theron continued, his gaze finding Elara, the one who opened the door to this prison will be honored. Elara is no longer a servant. She is hereby elevated to the rank of royal tutor and guardian to the prince. She will hold a permanent seat on my council, her voice representing the one we so foolishly ignored. He was integrating her human values, her compassionate wisdom, into the very structure of his non-human world. It was a revolution. The court, faced with the undeniable truth of the previous night's events and the absolute authority in their king's voice, bowed as one. Lord Valerius's faction was broken, his ideology shattered. Their respect for the king and their dawning understanding of the prince was solidified. They submitted to the new order. Months passed. The Citadel of Nocturne was transformed. The oppressive silence of the great hall was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, focused energy. In corners, nobles and guards could be seen practicing, their hands moving in the graceful, intricate patterns of the silent tongue. It had become a status symbol, a mark of those loyal to the new path the kingdom was taking. Elara stood on a balcony overlooking the main training yard. Beside her, Kaelen was engaged in a spirited, signed conversation with Seraphina. The guard captain, once so stoic, was now fluent, her scarred hands telling a story of a past battle with animated gestures. Kaelen laughed, a true, silent laugh that shook his whole body, just as Liam's once had. Theron came to stand beside Elara, his presence a familiar comfort. They often stood like this, watching the world they were building together. Their relationship was not one of romance, but of something deeper. A partnership forged in crisis, built on mutual respect and a shared love for the boy who was the future. He is happy, Theron said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a question. He is free, Elara corrected softly. You freed him. No, Theron said, turning to look at her, his winter eyes holding a warmth she never would have thought possible. You showed me the door was unlocked. I only had the courage to open it. Below, Kaelen looked up and saw them. He smiled and signed to his father, a complex question about a point of defensive strategy Seraphina had just shown him. Theron watched, and a small, proud smile touched his lips. He raised his own hands and signed back a long, detailed answer. The king who had forgotten how to speak from the heart had found a new language. In the ancient, silent kingdom of shadows, a new and brilliant light had finally dawned.